For as long as there has been art, there has perpetuated the idea that the best creatives are those with tortured souls. Broken or emotionally unstable individuals who channel that grief and sorrow into their works, amplifying the creation to be extensions of themselves, reflective windows into the creator's soul, or some form of catharsis to escape from inner demons. But is there any truth to this motif, or is it just a cliché? Today, let's find out. While the stereotype of creators being eccentric, unpredictable, and prone to emotional struggles is long established, it first emerged as a truly spoken and established trope during the Romance era. Of course, there are plenty of pre-Romance examples. Vincent van Gogh was a post-impressionist and famously struggled with his depression and mental health issues. It is widely seen that his emotions found their outlet and expression in the vibrant and emotionally charged paintings that define his greatness. Mozart, despite his undoubted brilliance, was plagued with financial difficulties, personal losses, and demanding patrons. Anybody who has read accounts of his performances will note the intensity of emotions and depth that he displayed during his performances. Katsushika Hokusai pioneered the ukiyo-e prints that defined the Edo period, but his art undoubtedly conveyed a sense of introspection that reflected his own tragic and poor life. Michelangelo's diaries show his emotional instability, self-doubt, and obsessive drive for perfection, and Hildegard of Bingen's expressed her spiritual experiences and struggles in her compositions and writings. While we have these pre-Romance examples, it wasn't until the Romance era was in full swing that the connection between suffering and art started to be considered and even celebrated, however. The Romance movement in Europe placed great emphasis on intense emotions, expressing individualism, and importantly, the exploration of inner turmoil through art. Romantic artists often portrayed themselves as tormented souls in their works, emphasizing the suffering and passion inherent in their creative process. Romanticism encouraged creatives to stand as individuals, to express their innermost feelings such as longing, despair, and passion. It, in a way, idealized suffering, propelling Byronic heroes to the top of fame through their brooding and tormented archetypes. In this era, torment became a byword for passion, and passion was something that artists had in spades. Goethe, Byron, Poe, Shelley, Friedrich, Beethoven, Keats, and then later others influenced by the movement, such as Kahlo, Kurosawa, Woolf, Plath, Sartre, Camus, and so many others that have come after the Romance era. Ralph Waldo Emerson once famously said, "To be yourself in the world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest achievement." Being a creative means that there is something inside you clawing to get out. That definition of tortured souls could just be the irresistible urge to be creative, but that it is being suppressed by circumstances around you. We should avoid labeling all tortured souls as mental illness, as this also gives the wrong impression. J.K. Rowling once famously said that we do not need magic to change the world, we all carry that power inside ourselves already. Often the tortured soul is the pain of lost love, which is not a mental illness, nor is it medically concerning to have a longing for travel or not have the ability to put your ideas into words or art. Neither is it a point of analysis to lack the resources, time, or opportunity to express yourself creatively. The idea of being a tortured soul can be broad and varied, and not easy to define, and this point works both in favour and against the theory. It is not precise enough to be accurate, but it is wide enough to be applicable. But we should also ask why the idea is so alluring too. Why do we want to believe that torment and negative life experiences can make us into better creatives? Well, part of that answer is in the question. Doesn't it make all our suffering and sacrifices worth it if they can help us create beautiful things later? Can't understanding that art was created through pain and hard experience lend it a certain authenticity and depth that is appealing to those of us who have not undergone such hardships? Knowing that the sunflowers were created by a tortured soul rather than a normal man in a shed makes them far more intriguing and authentic. It's the rebellious nature of the counterculture that so often feeds artistic expression, that by being emotionally vulnerable, you are better able to express challenges to societal norms. This comforts those who don't fit in, by espousing that there is a creative meaning behind torment. It's a coping mechanism of sort. Kurt Vonnegut said that the arts were not a way of making a living, but they are a very human way of making life more bearable. But we should also acknowledge that there is a destructive side to this belief too. Many people don't like the idea that we can be good at things without some form of suffering alongside it. Like the mad genius cliché, there is an expectation that artistic brilliance can only, or at least very often, come at the cost of personal well-being and social conformity. That you have to be different from the norm in order to produce something that is not the norm, i.e. original. The idea that art can be produced by stable and happy individuals certainly runs against the narrative of many in the creative field and is so naturally suppressed. We have to be careful not to encourage reckless drinking, like Hemingway, or the seeking of personally destructive experiences like those experienced by Primo Levi against his will. We have to be very careful about glorifying horrific events, romanticizing people in serious need of psychological counseling, or, God forbid, wishing that trauma on ourselves and being desperate to be the victim. We as people tend to be drawn towards destruction. Just look at the numerous examples of Netflix documentaries that focus on disasters or serial killers. There does seem to be an innate human fascination with the macabre. Not to say that all people feel this way, and the success of works such as Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings certainly show the universal appeal of positive stories. But as people do tend to be interested in destruction, it stands to reason that things produced by destruction would attract similar interest. But the big question is, do we need to suffer to produce good art, or for this channel, a good book? Well, the answer is no. There are beyond countless examples of works of creative beauty in every corner of the earth that have not been produced by someone we'd class as unstable, or from a background of particularly vicious suffering. So perhaps the better question is to ask, does having a tortured soul help? The major argument in favour of this trope is that there is a statistically significant number of very successful people in the creative industry who have had troubled backgrounds. I've already listed a significant chunk, but there are countless more. It is very easy to point to the paragons of creative outpouring and artistic talent as proof of this theory. Shakespeare, Oscar Wilde, Stephen Fry, Mary Wollstonecraft, Camille Claudel, and so many more that we could list them on and on. This trend appears in every culture, in each gender and background, and it seems to be a universal quality shared by humanity. Many of these creatives have openly and often spoken of how their adversity and struggle is reflected in their art and creative endeavours. Many psychologists and literary analysts often point to the idea that artists need to have some form of instability, that they need to have different personalities that allow them to inhabit the world they're creating. This theory is perpetuated as a consequence, and we are very eager to connect the dots. But is it simply correlation and cultural leaning rather than causation? It's almost self-explanatory that creative people will tend to be unique. By definition of the art they make, they are original and imaginative beings because they don't conform to the norm. Researchers at UCLA recently showed that highly creative people have a unique brain connectivity that tended to stay off the beaten path. But having different neurological behavior and biology doesn't automatically equal the possession of tortured souls. Or does it? The feeling of being isolated, a cage in search of a bird, as Kafka described himself, will also most certainly cause psychological issues. Creatives are different. They don't conform and they think differently. Sometimes that difference is destructive, sometimes it is positive. Sometimes writing provides space for these souls to escape into a world that they can understand, and everybody else is invited to join them on that adventure. Martin Amis said that there is a sense of freedom in writing. You're in charge. You're creating the world. Sometimes that creative outpouring is how the writer finds their sanity and allows them to more naturally adjust to the real world. It helps them contain the destructive power of their tortured soul by channeling it into their work. Stephen King said that life isn't a support system for art, it's the other way around. There are 4 counterpoints here, however. The first is the presence of a huge number of successful artists who don't fit the category of tortured artists. Jane Austen, Maya Angelou, Henry Matisse, Georgia O'Keeffe, Agatha Christie, Yayoi Kusama, Dr. Seuss, Hayao Miyazaki, or Octavia Butler, to name just a few of the countless examples out there of what we would consider reasonably adjusted, quote-unquote, normal people. These people run very much against the rule and show that the lack of trauma certainly isn't a barrier to creative success. This isn't to mean that they haven't suffered in some way, shape or form, but just that their suffering is not particularly unique. Now, some may argue that they are still unique or quirky in some element, but this simply leads to the second point. Suffering is nuanced, personal, and psychologically complex. We have to be very careful about oversimplifying the creative process or overstating the impact of life events on it. Picasso's stability has been a constant debate for his admirers, with some seeing his later works and lifestyle as a consequence of emotional instability, while others see it as a manifestation of his pursuant interest in approaching art and life in an unconventional way. People are infinitely more complex than their suffering, and defining the entirety of who they are, and therefore the entirety of their creative works, by that suffering seems disingenuous. Certainly many might be quite offended if you were to try and explain away all their education, training, reading and practice that they had invested into their profession by simply reducing it to trauma. Stephen King said that talent is cheaper than table salt. What separates the talented individual from the successful one is a lot of hard work. Much as many people would like our suffering to be balanced with creativity, those who have achieved success are loath to give up their hard work and perseverance and success for something outside their control. So the answer may lie somewhere in the middle, but it's clearly not as simple as trauma automatically equaling more creativity. We need to apply some nuance here. Let's not forget that creativity can be inspired by positive feelings too, such as joy, love and hope, and that these are no less meaningful emotions. Simone Weil once said, "Imaginary evil is romantic and varied. Real evil is gloomy, monotonous, barren, and boring. Imaginary good is boring, but real good is always new, marvelous, and intoxicating." We should be wary of romanticizing the negative at the expense of the positive. This is not least because there have been millions of people who have experienced adversity and were not magically gifted with the ability to write novels or put paint on canvas. It could be argued that they simply didn't have the opportunity, but there are certainly far more failed creatives than successful ones. There are far more people who have suffered in a billion different ways who weren't suddenly or magically able to express themselves artistically. On top of that, it is very hard to find people who have never suffered in certain ways or been tormented by some rogue thought in their head. We risk trivializing suffering or mental health by only accepting the creatives as legitimate victims. So we are presented with a set of tricky questions that undermine the theory. How do we measure trauma, or people's utilization of it, or a person's creative ability? How can we draw a concrete connection between the two without being romantically inclined to do so? I'm not convinced these questions can be assuredly answered. Does this mean that trauma isn't linked to creativity? Certainly not. It's more that we don't know to what extent it or the other factors that go into creativity, and perhaps we never will for certain. Now, this could be quite an anticlimactic place to leave the video, but I want to finish on something more positive and useful for you. There is something that all creative people have in common that is accessible to you without the necessity for severe suffering. All successful people have experiences. They have explored the world, either intellectually, emotionally, or physically, or all of the above. They have engrossed themselves in novels, travelled the world, and ventured to other cultures, seen events and met other people, deepened their understanding of certain fields of knowledge, and emerged with experiences that they can mould into stories and creativity. Creatives draw from what they know, what they have seen, thought, and experienced. The more you go out and about, the more you immerse yourself in fictional worlds, the more you speak to others and hear different perspectives, the easier it will be for you to be creative and be inspired by your own life and those of others. You will get a mix of negative and positives that give you the gift of perspective, contrast, and depth. It can be tempting to romanticize negative experiences like war or perceived societal stigmas, but the witnessing of breathtaking sunrises in Japan, or the wind rushing over the mountains, or a great conversation in a pub can all be equally empowering and inspiring. If you have negative experiences that you can leverage and fill you with passion to write, go for it. But if you don't, then don't lose heart either. The first bluebell of spring can stir joy. The pain of loss can stir grief, and passion can come from anywhere. All the inspiration you need is on the bookshelf or just outside the door.